They say a man who represents himself has a fool for a client. Well, with God as my witness, I am that fool.
What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG down there, YouTube.com. I like magic, you know by now, all that stuff. And today, I get to show you a rogue brew for the upcoming standard. Here is Sultai Reanimator. Now, this deck is inspired by the old Solar Flare decks from like 10 years ago, if you remember those. Basically Esper decks, blue, black, white, that played sort of a Reanimator strategy, sort of a control strategy. And I went with that template when I started making this deck, but I've gone with green instead of white. I felt like green made us a turn faster, a little bit more consistent, gave us some good reanimation targets to go after, and had stuff that lets us dump cards in our yards. I feel like green is a much better choice for this deck. And since we've added green instead of white, let's name this one after a different anime fighting move called Solar Beam. Now the first thing I want to do for a Reanimator deck is look at our Reanimators. We'll look at our Reanimatees in a second, but our Reanimators in this deck are 3 copies of Liliana, Death's Majesty, and 1 copy of Ever After. It's going down in the DM. Death's Majesty is just an awesome 5-mana reanimation spell in this standard. For the last few sets, Wizards has been like, you can't have good 4-mana reanimator spells that say creature on them. You know, we've got Refurbish, but that's artifacts. And yeah, we can get Hulks back with it. And it's not a terrible card, but I really want a black card that says creature specifically that costs 4 mana. And something like Unburial Rites would be really, really nice, but we're only really getting 5 mana and even 6 mana, as you can see here. Reanimation spells in standard. But as far as those 5-mana spells go, Liliana is the best one. It reanimates something for you on your turn and leaves a Planeswalker. Pretty good deal. It also helps that Liliana is just straight up versatile. You know, we can get zombies out of her. She mills stuff into our yard, so we can get reanimation targets into our graveyard. Good deal. And if you can ultimate her, which you're not going to do, it's few and far between, but if you want to get to her ultimate, it's not impossible, and it will often win you the game if you can get there. I mean, basically, exile or, you know, getting rid of everything but zombies on the board is a pretty good deal for you when you've been +1ing for a couple of turns. But she's mostly in here to reanimate something really, really big as early as turn 4, and she does that really well, and again, sticks around, lives to tell the tale. Which is pretty sweet considering you just put a huge creature into play to help protect a Liliana. So that's nice. Pretty good chance that you'll get to untap again with Liliana and start making zombies, and then the turn after that, you can reanimate something again if you want to. So you get 2 reanimations out of Liliana, then you've gotten an awful lot of value, you know. If you just reanimate something that costs 5 mana the turn Liliana comes into play, then you've technically gotten 10 mana worth of value that turn for your 5 mana investment. Not bad. As far as Ever After, I felt like it warranted 1 copy. I didn't want to play all 4 copies of Liliana for, I think, obvious reasons. You know, Planeswalker rule applies. So I felt like we had the slot open for Ever After. And there were a lot of really sweet tricks with Ever After in this deck. You will live happily ever after if you're able to pull off some of the cool stuff. And I'll go through as we look at some of these creatures in just a second and tell you about some of the cool stuff we can do. But Ever After is obviously good value. It is in itself card advantage. You know, you get 2 guys back, you only spent 1 card. Ever After can also generate value. I've already said it generates card advantage, but obviously if you bring back 2 creatures that cost more than a combined 6 mana, then you've gotten some value out of Ever After. And we can cast it as early as turn 5 in this deck. When you get a couple of huge dudes that cost a total of like 12 mana, then you've basically doubled your investment, which is always good. Ever After is not bad. If we're going to reanimate stuff, we have to have stuff to reanimate, right? Makes sense. So let's look at the stuff that we're going to be reanimating here, starting with 3 copies of Razaketh the Foulblooded. Now, the Riz is one of, if not the best reanimation target in Standard. An 8/8 flyer as early as turn 4 that we can, like, sack a mana dork or something and go get, like, whatever we want. That's really nice. You know, post-board, we can sack a creature and go get counter spells and respond to things that are on the stack. We can go get removal if we want to, tutor that up anytime we want. This allows us to play a sort of toolbox strategy. You know, we can sack a small guy and go get a huge creature that we can cast now that it's a little bit later on in the game. Aside from the fact that he's just a huge guy with evasion and we have to play that in a Reanimator deck, he also allows us to go get whatever we want from our library, given that we have some fodder for him. It's almost always worth it. There's also one more thing, the fact that this is a Reanimator deck, so we can always sack a creature to him and then just reanimate that creature again later. No big deal. But moving on to other stuff, because we're definitely playing other stuff. We're going to play 2 copies of Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger. You know, eye roll. I even had to eye roll, but we have to do it in this deck. You know, it's a chance. There is a chance that we'll get a 4th turn Ulamog, and we can easily pull off a 5th turn Ulamog. very easily. So we've got to do that. And yeah, we won't get the cast trigger if we ever after or Liliana it into play, but I'm not too worried about getting the cast trigger, provided that we now have a 10/10 indestructible guy that eats their library in 3 turns, even if they chump block it. That's good no matter what. Like, even if you can't get the cast trigger, this is probably still the best reanimation target in Standard next to Raza. There's also the fact that we're playing like some ramp elements in this deck, so if we have to, in the late-ish game, we can ramp Ulamog into play a turn or two early sometimes, which is also worth it. You know, you want to be able to hard cast Ulamog. The whole reason I'm not playing 3 or 4 copies of him and just slamming him on turn 4 as consistently as possible, because I really don't want him to be dead in our hand and just gumming up the works and being a dumb card that we can only look at. You know, costs an awful lot of mana to actually play him, and if we don't have discard outlets available, that's going to be tough. So I don't want all the Ulamogs, but I will play a couple. So in the off chance you get them on turn 4, that'll probably win you the game, even though you don't get to exile stuff. Whatever. I'm also going to play 3 copies of Verdurous Gearhulk in the deck. Kind of a surprise, but this is a fantastic reanimation target. It can be an 8/8. If you reanimate it on turn 4, you can ramp this into play on turn 4, even if you don't Liliana it into play. You know, it's good no matter when you draw it. It's an amazing top deck. It can make your mana dorks bigger. That's cool. You know, there's other tricks with it in the deck that I'll get to when I get to different cards. Like, Verdurous is just never bad to have. You know, decent reanimation target. You can ramp it into play in this deck. It's going to make your small guys bigger or just be a huge dude by itself. It can make Razaketh like a 12/12 flyer. You know, let's say you ever after Razaketh and Verdurous into play at the same time, you can have yourself a 12/12 flyer. And a 4/4 just chilling too, so that's not bad. Just Verdurous does everything, and I want some big stuff in this deck that we don't necessarily have to reanimate. Like, if we play a Verdurous Gearhulk and then it dies later on, we play Liliana, get it back, nothing wrong with that situation either. I'll take that every time. And the last big dude we're playing is 1 copy of the Scarab God for pretty obvious reasons. I talked for a long time about this during the Grixis deck, so I'm not going to go super in-depth here, but there are some cool tricks with the Scarab God outside of the usual stuff. I mean, the card is good, period, in and of itself. Being able to reanimate stuff at instant speed and like mess with combat, I've already talked about all that at length, and it's still amazing. But in this deck, there are some tricks aside from just that. One cool thing we can do is reanimate stuff from our opponent's graveyard and then sack it to Razaketh. It's totally fine, we can do that. Sometimes we can even pick up ETB effects, you know. And most of our creatures have cool ETB effects, you know. We can get a Verdurous back with this. That's pretty cool. Ulamog doesn't have an ETB effect, but at the same time, you know, getting a 4/4 indestructible that mills 20 every time it swings is still fine. It doesn't have to be 10/10 to do some damage. And obviously, Razaketh, even as a 4/4 flyer, is at least decent, and the ability to just search stuff up is fine too. So, and it's cool with Razaketh because you can always sacrifice dudes and then reanimate them with the Scarab God. All the things the card does usually are awesome, but in this deck, it's got specific things that it does that makes it kind of broken. Like this with Razaketh is pretty ridiculous. But another cornerstone of Reanimator decks is how we get those cards into our graveyard, and I think in these colors, we've got some ways to do that, so let's take a look at those. We're going to play 3 copies of Vessel of Nascency in the deck, 3 copies of Collective Brutality, and 4 copies of Champion of Wits. Now, Vessel of Nascency is a good way to get cards from our library into our graveyard. That's an important thing to be able to do sometimes. You know, you don't always want to have to discard cards in order to get reanimation targets. So it does that. And it also puts a bunch of different permanent types in our hand. Liliana, too. So that's very much worth noting right there. Also, it's an enchantment in the graveyard. We're running a very light Delirium theme because we've got Traverse the Ulvenwald in the main. Very important card. And we've got Ishkana in the sideboard. So we want to be able to hit Delirium, and having an enchantment to help us do that is nice. Collective Brutality is an all-star, and I hate that it costs so much, and I'm not 100% sure why it costs so much. Please enlighten me in the comment section, because I'm sure I'm missing something. But this card rarely sees play in Standard, and I'm not sure that I see it in other formats, so help me out with that. But Collective Brutality, despite its cost, has to be played in this deck, because it's just an amazing card for the deck. You know, it takes out small creatures, something that we really want to be able to do in this deck. It takes out small creatures early game so we don't get run over. Gets counter spells out of a control player's hand, something that can be equally important for our reanimation plan, too. And it lets us discard cards, obviously. We can even gain a little bit of life back against aggro if we have to, so that's cool. But mostly, the plan here is to discard at least 1 or 2 cards into our graveyard and reanimate them later. And Champion of Wits is another all-star. This card does everything, man. Like, first of all, obviously on turn 3, we get something that can block for us. We don't, again, something that lets us not get run over. We get a blocker. And we get a couple of cards, and we get to dump some creatures into our graveyard, if we have any at the time. All of that is so good. And when we do get to Eternalize it a little bit later in the game, if we ever get to, then we get 4 cards off of it, discard 2 more. And sometimes that can be really good in this deck, discarding a couple of cards. Even in the late game, you'll end up with an Ulamog in your hand very late in the game, and you'll have the ability to reanimate it, you just can't get it out of your hand. So that's totally fine late game to Eternalize your Champion of Wits. But this goes pretty well in the deck for a couple of other reasons. First of all, the Scarab God can reanimate it, and you'll get 4 mana for a 4/4 that draws you 4 cards and discards 2. That's a pretty good deal. If you ever after, by the way, a Champion of Wits and a Verdurous Gearhulk into play, you can get a 6/6 and draw 6 cards and discard 2. That's really good too, by the way. It's also, sacrifice fodder for Razaketh. It's a creature you can sacrifice to Riza, and then Eternalize later, so that's always good. Just so many reasons for Champion of Wits to be here. We need something that puts cards in our yard. This does that and everything else we could possibly want. Now, we're also going to play some ways to ramp in this deck so we can get to Liliana and reanimate something huge as quickly as possible. And we have to fix our mana too. So we don't have the best mana base in the world. So let's take a look at these guys real quick. We're going to play 4 copies of Channeler Initiate, 2 copies of Servant of the Conduit, and 1 copy of Cultivator's Caravan. Now, as far as Initiate and Servant go, both of these are a little bit more than just rampers and fixers. They're also creatures that we can sacrifice to Razaketh if we want to tutor something up. We need some creatures in the early game that we can sacrifice without having to worry too much about it. If we're out of energy, Servant of the Conduit is a good one to sacrifice. And if he can't ramp anymore, sometimes Channeler Initiate is a good one to sack. Both of these are also creatures that the Scarab God can reanimate and make bigger than they once were, so that's important note. They're also blockers, which we need in the early game sometimes if we want to survive. So I want a couple of dudes on the early end of the curve, and these are also rampers. They give us that benefit too. We can get to Liliana on turn 4. Let's play these guys. As far as Cultivator's Caravan, it's not a creature itself, but it is an artifact. Again, we're trying to get to Delirium at some point in the game for Traverse the Ulvenwald and Ishkana out of the board. So we've got to have some Delirium. This gives us a 4th artifact besides Verdurous Gearhulk. So there's that if it goes to our graveyard. It also lets us do, a ramp on turn 3, instead of having to have Initiate or Servant on turn 2. This gives us something that we can, ramp into turn 4 Liliana that we play on turn 3. Frees up our second turn for Collective Brutality or whatever else we're trying to do. Pop a Vessel that we played on turn 1, whatever. So this gives us a little bit more freedom in how we play out our first few turns and get to that turn 4 Liliana. That's good too. And, as I've already said, the mana could use some fixing, so I'm down for the one of Cultivator's Caravan to sort of clean things up. Also, I guess Channeler Initiate can crew this once it loses all of its counters, so got to point that out too. There's a little bit of synergy there, but Cultivator's Caravan's not going to do too much swinging for you. It's just a ramp element that's harder to kill than a creature. I think that's important. And we're going to finish off the deck with some other cards. I guess I just had to make this last category other because, these aren't things that reanimate cards. They're not things that we do reanimate, and they're not stuff that dumps cards in our graveyard. They are cards I feel like we need to play, starting with 3 copies of Fatal Push and 1 copy of Murder. Well, Fatal Push is a no-brainer. We can get run over sometimes by aggro. The first few turns of the game, we're a little bit vulnerable, so we're going to play Fatal Push to take care of everything from Heart of Kirin to Glint Sleeve and Long Tusk Cub and everything in between. There's just so many things we have to worry about in the early games. So Fatal Push is a good catch-all for a lot of that stuff. It's a little tough to get Revolt, but we're not too worried about it. We just want something that we can play for 1 mana and either play turn 1 or turn 3. Collective Brutality plus Fatal Push. Good way to use your mana on turn 3. Pop a Vessel of Nascency plus Fatal Push. Good way to use your turn 3. So we can definitely use Fatal Push to use our mana efficiently in mid-game turns, or we can just play it turn 1 or 2 on the draw and get rid of something important. Murder looks a little bit out of place in the deck, and it looks like a cuttable slot, but I just really wanted 1 card, just 1, that can kill anything. And this can be searched for in emergency situations. Sack a creature and let Razaketh go get it for you. If you absolutely have to have a murder, you can search it up. So I'm not too worried about playing only 1 copy here. We won't always need it, but we can find it if we absolutely need it, as long as we have a Razaketh. So there's that, and sometimes we'll draw it. Just having the one, it's not really a fun of. I think it's a necessary toolbox one of, more than it is a fun of. Just a really important card that can put huge stuff in our opponent's graveyard for the Scarab God to reanimate. So, gotta point that out too. But bottom line, I just want one removal spell that can kill anything. And to finish off the main deck here, just 3 copies of Traverse the Ulvenwald. I didn't want to go all out and play 4, but I think you probably could. This allows us to push down the mana base a little bit, stretch it out slightly, you know. We can go down to 23 lands in this deck, because we have Traverse the Ulvenwald to go get lands early, and we have Servant of the Conduit, you know, we have Channeler, Initiate, Cultivator's Caravan. We have other ramp elements. So we're essentially playing like 30-plus lands, or mana sources at least, in this deck. So Traverse the Ulvenwald helps out with that in the early game, fixes our mana, which can be very important, you know. We need 2 black for whatever reason early on in the game, especially post boards. We'll get Grasp of Darkness. We can just go like Blooming Marsh, first turn, Traverse the Ulvenwald, get a swamp, boom, 2 black Phantom. So just really, really helpful for getting the mana that we need at any given time. And once we have Delirium, obviously this can search up any old thing we want. For later on in the game, we can even hardcast Razaketh or Ulamog with it. But even if this goes and gets Razaketh or Ulamog, put it in your hand, and then you just Collective Brutality it out of your hand and reanimate it with Liliana. You know, you can do that too. Just so many uses for Traverse the Ulvenwald. It's good early, it's good late, fixes your mana, and tutors a guy for just 1. Just fantastic card. We're playing a green-black deck. I feel like we're either going to play Attune with Ether or Traverse, and we're not really doing too much with energy, so, you know, Traverse it is. Here's our mana base right here. There's 16 green sources, 13 black sources, and 12 blue sources, if you count Evolving Wilds as a source for each color, so keep that in mind. But there are some things I want to specifically point out about this mana base. There are plenty of ways to get green on turn 1. We have prioritized that, because we want to get Vessel of Nascency on turn 1, and sometimes we want Traverse the Ulvenwald on turn 1. So looking for green on turn 1 a fair amount of the time, so we prioritize that a bit. Keep that in mind. And there's a cool thing, a couple of tech things to point out. Obviously, Geier Sanitarium is in there as another discard outlet. That's important. We can even do this one on the opponent's turn. That's cool. Draw a card. All that's good. So that's, I feel like at least 1 copy is in order there. And Hissing Quagmire is pretty important too. This is a creature that can threaten to kill a huge guy on the opponent's side, you know, if they attack with it at least. And it's also a creature that can be sacrificed to Razaketh, which comes, that's important occasionally, you know. Sometimes Hissing Quagmire can just essentially turn other cards into, you know, cards that cost 3 plus their original casting cost. You know, for instance, you can activate Hissing Quagmire, tapping itself to do so. Sack it to Razaketh, and then go get a Traverse the Ulvenwald. That costs you 4 mana. You know, Murder will cost you 6 mana. Fatal Push will cost you 4 mana. So sometimes this can be really, really important. And here's our sideboard. There are the counter spells right there. We're going to play a Dispel and 3 Negates, mostly against other control decks. You know, we want to be able to push through that Liliana, or very late in the game, we can even push through like a Razaketh if we've got the mana for it, using a Negate. So Negate is just really important, and it's got other uses. It can counter Planeswalkers, artifacts like Oketra's Monument. We hate that deck so much. So it can counter that. It can counter a lot of stuff in this format. So Negate is just really important. And Dispel is specifically good. I don't know why I couldn't say that. Specifically good against control decks. Fatal Push is in there along with Grasp of Darkness against the aggro decks, and we definitely want the Bantu's Last Reckoning as well against the aggro decks. A very, very important card to make sure we don't get run over. And on our turn 4, we can still do stuff, you know, leaving all of our lands tapped. We can still cast a Traverse the Ulvenwald or cast a Vessel, maybe even a Fatal Push if they've recovered somehow, you know. So Bantu's Last Reckoning isn't terrible in this deck. We need a sweeper. It's probably the best in these colors. We've also got Dissenter's Deliverance, again, against the stupid Oketra's Monuments decks that are really hard to beat. It's also in there, though, against like Torrential Gearhulk and a bunch of other artifacts. You know, Crook of Condemnation is a good one. We can sometimes kill it early before, you know, we've got a huge graveyard going on. So Dissenter's Deliverance is important, and is another instant, as are a lot of cards in the sideboard for Delirium. Got to point that out. Ishkana is in there because it's also good against Heart of Kiran. Note all of the tech against Heart of Kiran in this board. We've got Fatal Push, Negate, Grasp of Darkness, Dissenter's Deliverance, and now Ishkana, all against Heart of Kiran. But obviously Ishkana is good on most boards, so we'll play the 1 copy in the sideboard. And then a Sphinx of the Final Word, again against Control. We want to be able to have some options against that deck. Here are your power rankings right here. Final score of Nintendo 64, which is pretty darn good, right in the middle of the competitive scale. You know, this deck is really explosive. effective, though. It can get an Ulamog as early as turn 4, and yeah, even though it doesn't get the cast trigger, we have seen what happens when decks can get to Ulamog on turn 4. Cards get banned and stuff. So that's pretty important to be able to do. And Razaketh on turn 4 or even 5 is perfectly acceptable too, you know. Being able to get a huge flying dude on your side of the board that can also go search up whatever you need for any given situation, yeah, we'll take that. We'll take that in Reanimator. So the deck is insane if its game plan actually gets off the ground. And it's got ways of clearing off the board until it can get there. You know, we got Fatal Push, Collective Brutality, bunch of stuff in our sideboard against aggro too. We've got stuff to block for us until we can make our game plan work. So we've got ways to extend the game until we can get to these huge guys. But there are some problems, you know. I've already mentioned Oketra's Monument. Against go-wide strategies, we can be in a little bit of trouble, and especially game 1, control can have our number too. That said, though, the deck doesn't necessarily have to accomplish its reanimation plan. It's just a really grindy deck, too, you know? We play close to 20 creatures in the deck. One of them can be, or 4 copies of these creatures can be externalized even without the Scarab God. If we do get a Scarab God into play, then we can grind the game out pretty easily. If we get on into the late game, we can hardcast any of our really big threats. If it comes to that, you know? We've got things like Verdurous Gearhulk in the mid-game to make all of our early game dudes bigger or just give them something they have to answer. Liliana doesn't necessarily have to reanimate a huge guy either. She can reanimate something like a Champion of Wits sometimes and be fine, or she can just sit there and make zombie dudes for you too. Just the deck is relatively versatile in its game plan because it doesn't have to be a reanimation deck. It just so happens that sometimes you'll get a huge guy on turn 4 or 5 out of nowhere, and that's where I compare the deck to Solar Flare. Even though the cards that counter stuff are in the sideboard, a lot of people think that the most important part of Solar Flare is the counter spells because it's a control deck. It's not necessarily true. Even though our counterspells are relegated to the sideboard, one of the biggest parts of Solar Flare is that the deck was really versatile and could do a bunch of different things against different decks, you know? And this deck is no different. We've got a lot of different game plans that don't just involve Herder turn 4 Ulamog, you know? We can do a lot more than that. But I think I'm tapped out for this one for now. Let me know how you felt about this one. This has definitely been a pet project of mine. This is Rogue Brew all the way. You know, I don't think anybody else is working on this dumb thing. But the deck can win games. I've already said it's really, really grindy, you know, and when you can get a huge dude, they have to answer on turn 4. Yeah, that increases your win percentage a lot. So try the deck out. Let me know how you felt about it and what you'd change. There's obviously a ton of options for this deck. You could go more controlling in the main deck. You could move those negates into the main deck. You could play, you know, disallow if you wanted to. It's really hard to find 2 blue on turn 3, which is one of the big reasons I didn't put disallow in the deck at all. I really wanted to at first, but the mana's not necessarily there in these colors. You know, you don't want to prioritize blue too much, is all I'm going to say. Really tough to get 2 blue on turn 3. But anyway, that's why the counterspells ended up in the board. But let me know if you do it differently. I'm open to it. You can also do other things besides just wait on the next video. You know, while you're doing that, you can like the video right here if you enjoyed the video. You can go back and like old videos. If you didn't, that'd be fine too. You can also check us out on Twitter at SBMTGDev. I want you to sub if you haven't done that yet. Make sure you hit the bell for notifications. Check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG. Anyway, YouTube spiel over. I hate that part, but I gotta do it. I gotta do it, you guys. I'm sorry. But anyway, I'm Deb from SBMTG, and I forgot Julie was sitting here. You've been here this whole time. But anyway, she is down here, by the way. She's just right here. I'm sorry I woke you up, baby. But anyway, I'm Deb from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.